Paul Lowe was an acclaimed photojournalist documenting conflict who later became a leading academic in London, teaching hundreds of photojournalists and documentary photographers over the course of 20 years. As a globe-trotting photojournalist, he was at the heart of key historical moments through the 1980s and 1990s. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, the siege of Sarajevo, famine in Africa, and the destruction of Grozny in Russia. He was a member of Network Photographers, then a Magnum Photo Agency nominee, a member of Panos Photo Agency, and a member of Seven Photo Agency. Cambridge educated, he was a wise photojournalist, and at the same time he had much heart. He continued to document Sarajevo long after the Bosnian War had ended and media attention had moved on, much like how Philip Jones Griffiths continued to document the consequences of the Vietnam War. Once he had a family, he stopped photographing conflict and threw himself into academia. He was a professor at the London College of Communication, where he made the MA in Photojournalism documentary photography course one of the leading programmes of its kind. He also pioneered an online model of the course nearly 20 years ago, way before online courses were cool. For me, as my MA teacher, he was the first photographer who really believed in my work. And that belief is something I've heard from dozens of his past students since his tragic death a few weeks ago at the age of 60. Today I go through his only photo book, the rare and out-of-print 2005 Bosnians. I first met Paul Lowe in 2005 when I interviewed for a place on the prestigious MA Photojournalism and Documentary Photography at the London College of Communication, and that was the same year that this book came out, Bosnians by Paul Lowe. Paul photographed the siege of Sarajevo extensively. Today's episode is going to be a little bit loose because I didn't really get into writing a massive script. Every time I was writing a script, it was making me quite sad. So instead what I thought I'd do is just look at the book and maybe read some texts. And that's what I'm going to do. So this is Paul Lowe's Bosnians, hardback book, documenting his time basically covering the war in Bosnia and the siege of Sarajevo. Just the most incredible cover shot, and potentially you'd think a very strange shot for a cover of a book essentially about conflict, but it's an incredible photo and I'll be dissecting that when we go through the book. It's very rare now and out of print. That's also why I wanted to make this video, because yeah, for love nor money, I think you maybe can get a copy for 250 quid now. And I just thought by going through this, and you know what, it's going to be a bit of a YouTube algorithm killer because I'm going to read everything. And as you know on YouTube, if you don't know, you're supposed to keep them snappy, 7 to 10 minutes, get low. I'm not going to do that for this one. I'm just going to cover everything. So it's in 2 languages, which is pretty cool. And obviously that's a big part of Paul's ethos as well, is that, you know, he's a very partisan photographer of the people, and obviously making a book for the people of Sarajevo to read it as well. So it's in 2 languages. Photographs Paul Lowe, essay Allan Little, Saki Books in association with the Bosnian Institute, and this was signed Paul Lowe, Sarajevo, June 2005. It's written for Amra, Zu Amra, that's his wife. And this is this panoramic scene here across Sarajevo. One thing that was a really horrific element of the siege of Sarajevo was the high mountains surrounding it. I think there are 4 mountains, and it basically just made it a sniper's playground. And that's what a lot of the book in a way also documents, was the kind of that constant tension of that sniper threat, that unseen threat. On leaving, this is a quote, E. Spencer, Travels in European Turkey, 1850. On leaving these savage wilds with their annoyances behind us and emerging from the depths of the roaring Malatska, my delight was not greater than my astonishment when I caught the first view of Bosna Sarai and its beautiful plain, a very vision of fairyland in a wilderness. So little indeed does the stranger expect to find a town so large and evidently wealthy in the centre of the ever-turbulent Bosnia. Its delightful environs, blooming gardens, rivers and rivulets, transparent as crystal, winding through a plain of unsurpassed for fertility, combine to form a landscape seldom equated for picturesque effect. Neither must we forget its gilded tower, the swelling dome, pointed minaret, and bazaars roofed with tiles of every shade and colour, all glittering in the sun. And the first chapter, because the book is in multiple chapters, is called The Siege. And again, this blurred photo here of someone running, trying to avoid sniper fire. Quote here, "You have my permission to shell, but do not touch the industrial infrastructure because we need the machinery. Shoot only at human flesh, shell only human flesh, only human flesh. intercept of General Ratko Mladic, Serb commander, ordering his troops to attack the town of Zelina Jara near Srebrenica, 1993. And there's a photograph here of this wounded woman being helped, and interestingly by Egyptian members of, I think it was the UN. And this photograph here of this wounded woman being helped by 2 Egyptian members of the United Nations. And that photo has a special significance for me, but I will say about that at the end of the video. In fact, I'm gonna wait till the end of the video to say a few things about Paul, for me on a personal level, because I know this isn't the Ed show. I want to make this about Paul, okay? Lovely series of images here, but obviously horrific images, but just the way the layout is, you know, it's quite an interesting layout here, showing the sort of chronology of this moment, of this person. So yeah, this scene continues here as the Egyptian UN people helping to sort of rescue people, and it's sort of almost in this sort of almost cinema style narrative. You're seeing these series of photos, and that's something you get with a lot of people who are trained as photojournalists, sort of shooting in sets of images, storytelling, you know, seeing that progression, seeing that element of what was going on before, during and after. The siege. During the 4-year siege of Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital, over 10,000 people were killed and 60,000 injured from a population of 350,000, which meant a 1 in 5 chance of being hit by sniper fire or mortar shells. The heroic efforts of doctors on the scene saved thousands of lives despite the difficult conditions they had to endure, including lack of electricity, medicine and water, and frequent shelling of the hospitals. Many, however, did not survive, including hundreds of children, often killed during lulls in the fighting when they would go out to play, only to be caught by a shell deliberately targeted to catch civilians out in the open. And there's some writing here, it's translated as never to be forgotten. So this is a portrait of the former president of Yugoslavia, Marshal Josip Broz Tito, riddled with bullet holes. And there's quite a long quote here by Alexander Hemon from The Question of Bruno. Suppose there is a point A and point B, and that if you want to get from point A to point B, you have to pass through an open space clearly visible to a skillful sniper. You have to run from point A to point B, and the faster you run, the more likely you are to reach point B alive. The space between point A and point B is littered with things that sprinting citizens have dropped along the way. A black leather wallet, probably empty. A purse, agape like a mouth. A white plastic water vessel with a bullet hole in its centre. A green red-brown shawl ornamented with snowflakes, dirty. A wet loaf of bread with excited ants crawling all over it as if building a pyramid. A video cassette dismembered, several of its pieces connected to a dark rivering tape. On days when snipers are particularly rabid, there are scattered bodies as well. Some of them may still be alive and twitching towards the distant cover, leaving a bloody trail behind like snails. People seldom try to help them, for everybody knows the snipers are waiting for just that. Sometimes a sniper plays with the body, shooting off his or her knees, feet or elbows. They seem to have made a bet how far he or she is going to get before bleeding away. People stand in the line at point A waiting for their turn to run across. When it is your turn, you cannot wait, you have to go, because the longer you wait, the readier the sniper is. The first time I ran from point A to point B, the fear was unspeakable indeed. Pain in your stomach, as if a big steel ball were grinding your bowels. Blood throbbing in your neck veins. Wet heat inside your eyeballs. Sweat trickling down your cheeks like a miniature avalanche of dread. You see no life unwinding before your eyes. All you see is 1 or 2 meters before you, and all the things that you can trip over. You hear every tiny sound, your feet brushing away dirt and rubble, distant detonations, cries of scared and wounded people, whistling ricochet bullets, and the death rattle from the person behind you. Someone here waiting to go, and it says, to go or not to go, that's the question. Again, a series of photographs here of people trying to run to avoid sniper fire. Here we go, some kind of shrapnel with people kind of glimpsed through the shrapnel here. Again, sort of interesting book design going full bleed across there, same with this one. It's a very strange photo here. It says here, Ismet Barjomovic, otherwise known as Cello, was a militia leader at the start of the war. He trained his pet pit bull terrier to attack anyone who pointed a gun at him. Paul studied photography at the Newport School. It's a famous school for like photojournalists and documentary photographers. He was a very proficient and great photojournalist, and whatever you want to think about his work, if you take in like the gamut of all the great photographers, like Paul was producing a lot of this photo under like sniper fire, shelling. It was a war. He's not sauntering around like Henley on Thames, like getting nice snaps of people sat in like deck chairs. Like, a lot of these photographs were taken under the most insane conditions, and sometimes also very banal conditions, like this shot here of the kind of UN guys with the bag and the luggage. But even in this moment, the way the boy has covered his eyes with his hands, it's like he's not willing to look. The car door, the framing, you know, there's a sense of drama there. Some text here from George Kinney, former US press officer for Bosnia. The Bush administration's pronouncements on the Yugoslav crisis between February and August exhibited the worst sort of hypocrisy. I know, I wrote them. For 7 months, in addition to other dates, I was responsible for drafting most public statements on the crisis in Bosnia from the State Department's Yugoslav desk in Washington. My job was to make it appear as though the US was active and concerned about the situation, and at the same time, give no one the impression that the US was actually going to do something significant about it. The goal from the beginning was not good public policy, but good public relations. And from that perspective, the administration's approach was a smashing success. It managed to downplay the gravity of the crisis and obscure the real issues. The trick was to ignore facts, whether they pertain to atrocities, rumours of concentration camps or starvation. They would complicate the policy goal of not getting involved. I just couldn't stand it anymore. Writing stuff that was covering up our inability to deal with the problem, and by covering it up, we were letting things get worse. I got fed up. Every day it was lies. You know, one time I even proposed that the department spokesman say US officials lied yesterday. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Depressingly familiar. So this photograph is the interior of the National Library, destroyed by Serbian incendiary shells in an attempt to wipe out Bosnians' cultural heritage. Thousands of irreplaceable historical manuscripts, particularly those dating from Ottoman times, were burnt. Families say goodbye to their relatives as they prepare for evacuation by the UN of the wounded and vulnerable from the besieged city. You look at that woman's face. Sort of the hands, the body language. Look at this. There's so much going on here. That hand reaching out here, the boy looking at the mum, the girl looking on. Is that the father? But yeah, amazing composition. And again, that's why I love photojournalism and documentary photography. Like, this is real. This is real. It's not some clever thing someone made up, like constructed some image. It's like an old painting, they've constructed it. No, it's not, it's real. It has huge weight, and that's one thing that led to Paul obviously being so tied into organisations that were part of history, not necessarily part of Photoland. So this is operating on the wounded in the main Kosovo hospital. So quote here from Roy Gutman, Town's mayor pleads for bombing to end misery, Newsday, April 21st, 1994. You may not understand what I'm describing here. I urge you to ease our pain. Bomb Gozard and the citizens of Gozard. I appeal to UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali. We cannot hold out any longer. Let him take just half the aircraft the UN used in Iraq not to bomb Serb positions, but to bomb the citizens of Gozard. Bomb the city to allow a faster and less painful death. The citizens of Gozard will forgive him and the world for that. At least let them die in dignity. This is no empty phrase, it's from the heart. You know, it's brutal. People obviously lost limbs. And the dead. Again, little vignettes here of bodies and shoes. Probably going to get the video blocked or some bullshit for showing that. I'll probably have to blur it. You know what? This is so bullshit. Like, I have a forum now. I can share my videos on YouTube, right? I can share stuff, yeah? But at the same time I can't. I've been wanting to do a video about Gaza for like a year now. I've got 1,000 bookmarks in various social media of the most horrific photos and videos you've ever imagined in your darkest nightmares. And I can't share them on YouTube. I'll get my channel banned. I can't even post a video about it and link to it because I'll get my channel banned. I think even if I talked about it, someone could say I was inciting hatred or something and get my channel banned. It's really bonkers, isn't it? So there we go. But it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Louise Gentile, UNHCR official, Srebrenica, 1993. Body parts and human flesh clung to the schoolyard fence. The ground was literally soaked with blood. One child, about 6 years of age, had been decapitated. I saw 2 ox carts covered with bodies. I did not look forward to closing my eyes at night for fear that I would relive the images. I will never be able to convey the horror. So, funeral here, children hugging again, just, it sounds so crazy, but like in these horrific moments to also have such great composition. This is one of the things that was kind of the end almost to George Roger, one of the founding Magnum photographers. He was at a concentration camp at the end of World War II, and he was framing a composition of like a mass grave with thousands of Jewish bodies. And like he was like, what am I doing? I'm like composing the nice image of the horror, and then he went off to Africa to photograph tribes and stuff like that. So that was it. But like, if you're going to do it, you got to do it. When Paul was a student, he had like photos by James Nachtwey at Cambridge University, kind of as like what to do. And obviously James Nachtwey is still like undisputedly one of the greatest living war photographers, and that was someone that Paul Lowe very much idolized. Let's go sledging to the street in the old town protected by houses. Nothing will happen to us. That's what I said 5 to 6 years ago, and that's how my boyfriend got killed. George Kenny again, former US press officer for Bosnia. If the situation was reversed in Bosnia and a fanatical Muslim regime in Belgrade was slaughtering thousands of innocent Christians in Sarajevo, then America would have reacted by now. We would not watch Christians get killed by Muslims in Europe, period. But we can watch Muslims get killed by Christians. The problem for Bosnia was larger than the fact that George Bush was getting clobbered by Bill Clinton in the polls. Bosnia was Islam. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, always love this photograph. If you're not aware, my breakthrough photo essay was about people who rescue and rehome battery farm chickens. So imagine my surprise when I saw this great shot of Paul where it's like a guy missing a tooth and he's got a chicken in a box. Love it. And that's the weird thing as well with a lot of Paul's photographs. Yeah, there was the horror of war, but there was everyday life. And you have to do that. Think about Philip Jones Griffiths, obviously was kind of part of like Paul's orbit. He was photographing the Vietnam War and didn't just hang out with the GIs. If anything, then he stopped hanging with the GIs and started hanging out with like the real people, the civilians. And in that way, he got a completely different take on the conflict rather than just people running around holding guns. This chapter is the living. The citizens of the city had to go and collect water every day from pipes in the street, often crossing intersections under sniper fire. Gas and electricity were cut off for long periods during the 4 years of the siege of Sarajevo, so trees were cut down and anything that would burn, including books and clothes, were used to keep fuel and keep warm during winters that reached minus 10 degrees Celsius. Food too was scarce and rationed, with a kilo of coffee reaching 100 DM, 50 euros on the black market. The inhabitants of the city had to learn to grow their own food, converting parks and open spaces in front of their apartment buildings into vegetable patches. Under siege, Sarajevo changed from a vibrant modern metropolis into something resembling a medieval stronghold. However, despite all privations and dangers, its citizens continued to make art, music, theatre and dance, and would sometimes make the long and dangerous journey to the centre of the city on foot or bicycle just to maintain a sense that they were still part of the human race. Lovely light here. And again, really nicely designed book, look at these grids here. All these people going about their day. Danger sniper. Great depth. Beautiful. This lovely child here. The mum in the back, I assume maybe the mum, I don't know. But lovely child here and this crutch. I mean, that's the thing that breaks it for me, isn't it? It's this sort of this edge of a crutch. Obviously, that's probably someone who's lost a limb during the conflict. It's there to remind you, but then what else reminds you? There's bullet holes in all the glass. But look how well she's presented. I mean, yeah. These are people trying to cross a damaged bridge. It looks like getting water, trying to get water, like quite precarious there. Again, nice thing in the book, they're sort of trying to show that element of narrative, If you're a photojournalist, you don't know what's going to happen next. You'll take a shot, but then you don't know if that's the shot. You're going to see what happens next. And just in that process alone, on a contact sheet or a series of photos, you'll see that there's kind of almost a storyboard element to them. Growing vegetables here. Again, look at this moment. like catching that pickaxe here but not blocking the negative space. I mean, it's bizarre I'm talking like this. I know I sound like a complete robot, but that's one thing you have to consider. You're a photographer. And I think obviously Paul understood that. It's that weird dichotomy of like, you know, you have to do a good job. And for a photographer, doing a good job is having like good composition or good moments. Like look at the way the girl's putting that face to the little boy and what she's wearing. So this has become quite an iconic photograph, this little girl playing with a ball by like an anti-tank device. There's some writing here. It says, "First time I heard the sound of a mortar shell, I was somewhere around the place of the photo. I still remember it exactly. It was May the 5th, 1992. I was 11 years old. Recently I wrote this." You know what? I can't read that because I can't translate it. Unless that's what... No, I can't read it. But anyway, there we go. Again, like look at your placement here, you know. Whatever this person's doing with a gun. Is it a toy gun? Yeah. It's like toy guns, cardboard gun, and the little kid, the funny pose in the background, or the, you know, it's raining and wearing this wacky hat. Like, Paul Lowe was incredible because he was a war photographer, and I'll read some excerpts from Russell Miller's 50 Years at the Frontline, a History of Magnum book, which are absolutely horrific. But like, he was fun. He was a fun guy. He was a crazy, lovely guy who liked to dance. He'd like Northern Soul. He did salsa dancing. He was super positive. He had a wonderful way of engaging with you and really, you know, all students like really focusing in on what it is you're trying to accomplish and trying to help you, making connections. Just an amazing man. And I know many other war photographers who, mate, they're just gone. They are just gone for whatever reason. Like the things they've seen have just obliterated them on an emotional level. Whereas Paul was still very loving, very fun, which obviously goes against, you know, all the things he'd seen in life. But even in this, you can see there was laughter and there was love. And that's the whole thing with this weird divine comedy we're all in, is there's, you know, there's tragedy, but there's also comedy. There's also all this other stuff going on. So again, as a photographer, it's really cool that, yeah, he's not just doing all the photographs, the most horrific stuff imaginable. He's like showing kind of every life. And in that, there's juxtaposition. In that, it makes it even more powerful. There's this whole thing, you know, I go on about, but, you know, there's some people say photography can be, a photograph can sometimes be a window, like you're looking onto something, but it also can be a mirror. And in shots like this, man, this is Paul. You can see his lust for life. You know, I haven't read the caption for this one, but whatever's going on, it's this lovely event. They're popping a cork of champagne, it's pulling a face, they're all laughing and playing. And what's this one? It says a teenage rock band playing outdoors, kid in the Iron Maiden t-shirt there. And what's going on here? Let me check the caption here. I took a photo. Oh, it's New Year's Eve at Obala Arts Centre, 1993. So here, General Francis Brickmore, Belgian UN commander in Bosnia. It is difficult for me to leave Sarajevo. The city is for me the reflection of the Europe I love, multicultural, multi-ethnic and multilingual. Your city, much like Brussels, where I live, is a city of crossroads. If Europe loses these crossroads, it will become substantially impoverished. I don't know if what I say is clear to you, but you can imagine how much I admire you all, Muslim, Serb or Croat, for your dignity in these trying times, for your fierce spirit of resistance and for the strong resolution with which you refuse to let die the spirit of Sarajevo. I don't know if you'll succeed in your goals. The whole of Europe is stricken these days with a narrow nationalism that is more and more directed against the values of the other, instead of being based on the peaceful expression of each culture. The names of Sarajevo and Bosnia-Herzegovina will stay imprinted forever in my memory. I leave part of my heart in Sarajevo and part of my European soul. I'm not sure if I have been able to do much for you. Being a UN soldier can be quite frustrating, but you have given me the strength to go on defending your cause wherever I'll be in the future. Goodbye, Sarajevo, and I hope I'll see you soon under a regain peace. Right, I said I was going to do it. I'm going to read this essay. Again, probably YouTube, like death, like people will just stop watching. I don't care. I'm not filming this for you. I'm filming for the people who are still watching and want to hear this. So here we go. This is the essay by Allan Little. I'll try and do it as best I can, okay? My war was your war too. We went as far as the Bosnian army checkpoint at Terb, near Travnik, and waited. This was the new front line, the latest place to which Bosnians had been forced to fall back in the face of the onslaught. It was October 1992. The war was 6 months old. Ahead of us lay a narrow road rising in a gentle gradient and disappearing into the tan, ochre-coloured woodlands above us. Down this road they came, a pitiless procession of the exhausted and frightened. There were farm courts pulled by horses, crammed with extended families of 40 or 50 people, the young and healthy hanging from the slated sides, but most were on foot. As they trudged down that road, a cold autumnal mist rose and swirled around them. Wet mud clung to their clothes. They were coming from Jace. I'm so sorry I'm getting all these names wrong. I know I'm always terrible with pronunciations, but look, man, I'm just doing the best I can here. And there were said to be 40,000 of them. We stopped to question one among this multitude. Tall, stooped and white-haired, in a filthy wet greatcoat, he looked like a walking corpse. He was more than 80 years old and had been walking for 2 days. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead. He'd slipped and fallen on the road. The man carried what looked like a medical bag. I've lost all my instruments, he said. I had to leave them behind. What instruments, we asked. Medical instruments? No, he said. Musical instruments. I have a grand piano that belonged to my grandfather. He sent it to me from Dubrovnik in 1946. And a beautiful violin. I wanted to leave them to my grandson. He is a fine musician. It hit me like a train, as it always did, the shame of it. I knew that the world I was paid to communicate with would not want to know that he was a musician or a grandfather. It would want to know simply whether he was a Muslim or a Croat or a Serb. Naked, militarized nationalism, the politics of forced exclusion, had robbed him of his home and everything in it. The world outside, and its insistence that this was an ethnic conflict of the sort that had typified Balkan history for generations, would now also strip him of his humanity, and he was only one of millions. In the capitals of the Western world, the war was horribly complicated, essentially ethnic in nature. All sides were guilty in equal measure, and there was nothing that could be done. After all, we were reminded this was the Balkans. This account bore little resemblance to the war I was watching unfold every day. Those people trudging down the hill from Jake, the place where Tito had proclaimed the non-ethnic Republic of Yugoslavia in 1943, that was the former president, were not, as many of my editors in London seemed to insist, fleeing the fighting. There was precious little fighting. There had been precious little fighting in the nameless towns and villages of northern and eastern Bosnia during the terrible summer of 1992. There was no fighting. There was ethnic cleansing. Thank you, Radovan Karcevic. Thank you, Ratko Mladic. Thank you, all the ideologues of ethnic supremacy. You gave the lexicon of conflict this new, strange and detestable piece of terminology, and it will forever be associated with Bosnia. Newcomers to Bosnia like me would devour Rebecca West's famous accounts of her travels there in the 1930s, Black Lamb and Grey Falcon. By the time she published this huge memoir of more than 500,000 words, World War II had broken out. She dedicated the book to all my friends in Yugoslavia who are now either dead or enslaved. There was one line among all those words that lodged itself in my mind. She was glad, she said, that spring had come late to Sarajevo, because this had enabled her to see snow on the roof of a mosque, of a building she had only associated with hot desert lands. The incongruity of this image, she said, had attracted her, because it seemed emblematic of the very pleasant incongruity of Bosnia itself, a European country not defined by the ethnic or religious adherence of its people, but by an extraordinary melange of overlapping and blended traditions, a country of diversity, tolerance, peaceful coexistence. In the summer of 1979, I put a pack on my back and with my best friend from school set out across Europe. We were 18 years old. It was the first time we'd been away from home, and we were on the adventure of our lives, our first exhilarating summer of grown-up freedom. While most of our friends headed for the beaches of Greece or Spain, we were intent upon another destination altogether. We wanted to go to Sarajevo, to the place where in 1914 a volley of pistol shots had rung out and changed the fate of humankind. We thought of it as the place where the 20th century had begun. We wanted to stand on the spot where Franz Ferdinand had fallen, to consider our century in all its folly and blood and horror, and all its hope of progress from the perspective from this precise location. I had no idea then how much of me Sarajevo would come to claim, how it would insinuate its way into my heart and lodge itself there. I had no idea that I would come to think of Sarajevo not only as the place where the 20th century began, but also where it would end. But there was another reason when we came as teenage boys to Sarajevo that summer. My generation grew up during the Cold War, in the shadow of the threat of nuclear annihilation. In our young minds, Yugoslavia seemed to hold out the prospect of something else, something better than a doomed bipolar division of our continent and our world. Bosnia, with its refusal to be one thing or the other, but to be all things, seemed to us even then to have something from which the rest of Europe could learn. Why did I, along with so many other foreign journalists, stay throughout a war that was not ours? Why did we become so enfolded by it? For me, the answer is straightforward. I could not look into the eyes of a broken old man from the mountains of central Bosnia, who'd been a musician all his life and was now stripped of everything, and then walk away. I could draw a line from that old man down through the ages of humankind in the spirit of John Donne's No Man's an Island. I wanted, with more passion than I've ever been able to bring to any other professional assignment, to persuade the world to look him in the eye too. In my naivety, I thought it would make a difference. There is a sense in which the end of a war is more traumatic and harder to face than its beginning. When war starts, you're in an emergency. You respond by learning how to survive, where to take cover, where to find water, how to get to as safety as possible, how to communicate with your friends and family, how to check that everyone has got to the end of the day or the week or the month alive. You think about getting to the end of the day. You have no future beyond this urgent priority. You think that as long as you can make it through to the end of the war, the emergency will lift and you can go back to the way things were. But you can't. When war ends, the future opens up infinitely in a way that you have not known for years. You see the country you came from and to which you expected to return has been destroyed. You ask yourself why those who did not make it had to die, and you find no answer. This seems to me in some ways an experience that is much harder to grow reconciled to than the physical dangers of war itself. It struck me that Sarajevo sank into a state of depression when the war ended. Foreigners in the city who had made to feel welcome during the war itself, despite the fact that many came from countries who repeatedly turned their backs on the suffering, now felt themselves resented by a population that had been so generous at the worst times, but now appeared bitter and taciturn. Stripped of the burden of day-to-day survival, many of my friends who'd faced a war with unflinching courage and a powerful sense of purpose now seemed to drift, unable to set course, to find direction. This was the sadness that seemed to me to grip Sarajevo in the years after the war ended. I felt it myself. On my first return to the city after the signing of the Dayton Peace Accord, I walked in parts of the city that had been off limits to me throughout the siege. From the hauntingly beautiful lanes and alleys of Baskaja, I wandered through down to the burned-out shell of the National Library, and then along the north bank of the river. At Vrabanja Bridge, I crossed to the southern bank and walked into the shattered suburb of Grabos. I looked up to the squat yellow cube of the Holiday Inn, the building that had housed the foreign press, and which had in effect been my home. What struck me was the distance. Everything was so close. The spot on which I now stood had been so inaccessible it might as well have been another country, but it was only a dozen metres from where I had slept night after night after night, and from where my colleagues and I had tried to communicate something of what Sarajevo was undergoing to an outside world which for the most part seemed unmoved. It was the distances that did it for me. Though rationally I had known precisely how close the front lines had been, seeing it now for the first time left me bewildered and ashamed. I tried and failed to choke back tears. I was overwhelmed by the grotesque futility of it all, the avoidability, the needlessness. I had spent 4 years of my professional life trying to make sense of the confusion, and now I could make sense of nothing. The sense of purpose that had kept me coming back to Sarajevo again and again during the siege was now denied me. I was for the first time, I think, utterly despondent, overcome with grief and sunk in cynicism. And yet the war was over. Did I miss my war? Was I, the thought horrified me, somehow sorry it was over? The country that I'd come to know and love, Bosnia at war, no longer existed. I still don't understand the paradoxical emotions that accompany the end of a war. I went to see my friend Jasmina. She was struggling with this paradox too. You tell me how to trust again. You tell me, she said, because I don't know how. But Bosnians will live together again. They will trust each other again, and they will do so because they always have. Ethnic separation makes no sense, not economic, not geographic, not cultural. And the lesson of that whole shameful episode in the history of our continent is that so unnatural is ethnic separation in that part of the world that it could only be achieved through the barrel of a gun. So Bosnia will knit itself together again because there is no alternative, but not yet, not for a long time, for the end of a war is more traumatic than its start. Yeah. The missing. During the ethnic cleansing of Bosnia, along the border with Serbia, tens of thousands of Muslims were executed. Some were thrown into the Drina River, their bodies would wash up downstream, throats cut, but most were buried in secret graves all over the country. Today over 20,000 people are still missing, and every summer the Bosnian Commission for Missing Persons, along with the Red Cross and the International Commission on Missing Persons, send out search teams to slowly and painstakingly uncover, exhume and identify remains. They use DNA sampling as well as clothing, dental records and bones themselves. The most notorious massacre was at Srebrenica, and some 4,000 sets of remains from this atrocity are still to be fully identified. Several hundred have been properly identified, however, and have been buried in a memorial centre on the site of the massacre. Again, a surreal image here of the scythe, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, the scythe obviously connotation with death and the Grim Reaper, but in this context, something else. Sanctioned massacres became possible to the extent that we deprive fellow human beings of identity and community. Thus, when a group of people is defined entirely in terms of a category to which they belong, and when this category is excluded from the human family, then the moral restraints against killing them are more readily overcome. And that's a quote by Herbert Kellman, Violence Without Moral Restraint, Reflections on the Dehumanization of Victims and Victimizers, The Journal of Social Issues, Volume 29, Number 4, 1973. And again, it feels very familiar to me right now. That kind of taking of a group, denying them of their humanity to allow them to be treated in the most inhuman way. The nations of the West must live forever with the knowledge, even as our fragmentary awareness of these crimes grew into disputable facts, we did far too little. Mass deaths were left to occur, enshrouded in our denial. The evil represented in this museum is incontestable. It is absolute. As we are its witness, so must we remain its adversary. We owe that much to the dead, as we owe it to our consciousness and our children. So we must stop the fabricators of history and the bullies as well. Left unchallenged, they would still prey upon the powerless, and we cannot permit things to happen again. US President Bill Clinton's address at the opening of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C., April 22nd, 1993. And again, like, really weird, obviously they're trying to put a skeleton together, sort of trying to work out who it was, and this is someone, I assume, in like a suit, who's part of that team, just sort of lying under a tree. A team from the Bosnian Commission for Missing Persons carries out an exhumation of a mass grave holding over 70 bodies. Zvornik was one of the first towns to fall to the Serbs at the beginning of the war in 1992. These bodies are from a group of 750 Muslim men who disappeared at the time. But yeah, again, like just that image just as is. Any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group such as... Article 2 of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, December 1946. So here we go. Any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Again, sounds familiar. It's really messed up, isn't it? It's really messed up. Okay, quote by Blaine Harden here, refugee witness massacres every day at the bridge on Drina, Washington Post, August 7th, 1992. The Serbs took the prisoners to the railing of the bridge. They forced them to lean forward. Sometimes they would shoot them and sometimes they would cut their throats. They threw them all into the river. They ordered me and a man who was even older than me to walk towards the bridge. We came across the body of an old man with a mutilated head. They ordered us to drag him towards the bridge. As we were dragging the old one, his skull was falling open and the brain came out. We dragged the body to the bridge and they ordered us to throw it into the Drina. There were 2 more bodies on the bridge. They had their throats cut. We were ordered to throw them into the river as well. On one of the bodies, 4 fingers of the left hand were freshly cut off. Torture. So I think I know what these photos are about looking at the captions. This is obviously people trying to identify bodies. Right, Ivo Andrich, Bridge on the Drina. The people were divided into persecuted and those who persecuted them. That wild beast which lives in man and does not dare to show itself until the barriers of law and custom have been removed was now set free. The signal was given, the barriers were down. As has so often happened in the history of man, permission was tacitly granted for acts of violence and plunder, even for murder, if they were carried out in the name of a higher interest according to established rules and against a limited number of men of a particular type and belief. In a few minutes, the business quarter, based on centuries of tradition, was wiped out. It is true that there had always been concealed enmities and jealousies and religious intolerance, coarseness and cruelty, but there had also been courage and fellowship and a feeling for measure and order, which restrained all these instincts within supportable limits, and in the end calmed them down and submitted them to the general interest of life in common. Men who had been leaders in the commercial quarter for 40 years vanished overnight as if they had all died suddenly, together with the habits, customs, and institutions which they represented. Really insane photo here, obviously a skull and a photo of a man, and it's like, that's his skull, and it's like, it's something so banal as like a passport photo. Do you know what I mean? So this photograph here is victims' clothes left out and washed to dry. Quote here from experience of one ex-prisoner from Omarska camp 1992. The witness stated that a young Muslim man from Khorasak who owned a Suzuki motorcycle was tortured in front of the other prisoners. He was severely beaten all over his body and his teeth were knocked out. The guards then tied one end of a wire tightly round his testicles and tied the other to the end of the victim's motorcycle. A guard got on the motorcycle and sped off. One survivor, Amir Jakubovic, told journalists he was ordered by his Omarska jailers to castrate 3 prisoners. They forced me to tear off their testicles with my teeth, so I tore off their testicles with my teeth. They were screaming with pain. Impossible? At a refugee centre in Croatia, I interviewed a man who said he witnessed this episode. After beating us for a while one night, the guards got tired, Ibrahim told me. They decided it would be a good idea to have the prisoners fight each other. A guard singled out me and another prisoner. He told the other prisoner to stand still and he told me to punch the prisoner as hard as possible in the face. I did it. But the guard said I wasn't doing it hard enough. And so he hit me in the back of my head with the butt of his gun. He kept hitting me until I was covered in blood, and then he took another prisoner out of the line and told him to hit me. Missing items, obviously items belonging to the dead. I think Zia Gaffick was a photographer around that time who Paul Lowe really kind of helped and was kind of, in his orbit, and he did a very similar project as well. So it's graffiti written by UN soldiers. The first mass burial in 2003 of over 500 of the victims of Srebrenica at the memorial built on the site of the massacre, and that's here. It's a bit weird, I've got the captions on, but the captions are in the back of the book, so I thought I'd do this. It's this photograph. The women of the Baltic family pray as the remains of their husband and brothers are buried. Quote here, Roy Gutman writing about the Manjaka camp, Newsday, July 19th, 1992. Heads bowed and hands clasped behind their backs, the Muslim prisoners lined up before their Serb captors. One by one they sat on the metal stool and then knelt to have their heads shaved. An order was given that could not be heard from 200 yards away, and each group of 20 then returned to the double to the sheds in which they lived in near darkness. Guards at the entry swung their rubber truncheons as if in anticipation of the beatings to come. Mesa Slemovic, Deaf and the Dervish. On that day we will ask hell, are you full? And hell will answer, are there any more? Again, this woman at a grave, obviously, but like, look at that light. There's this insane kind of lens flare going on. It's almost burnt out this image like some other force. Like, Paul was like a war photographer, but he saw in a very kind of poetic way, which is weird, isn't it? It's not what you expect of this kind of photography. So this chapter's called The Return. The Return. Since the end of the war, refugees, mostly Bosnian Muslims, have slowly and painfully begun the task of returning to their former homes, from which they were expelled at gunpoint by paramilitaries. Some of their houses have been rebuilt with the aid of international charities, but many pay for the work themselves, living in whatever accommodation they can just for the sake of returning home. The landscape is littered with the remains of houses destroyed by Serbian forces during the ethnic cleansing of areas like Drina Valley in eastern Bosnia along the Serbian border. The valley was the scene of some of the worst atrocities of the war, with thousands of Muslims killed and expelled from towns like Visgrad, Foka and Guzard. These ruins stand like shocked faces, mute witnesses to the horror that befell these beautiful hills. This quote here says, this refugee family lives in an old shipping container in the camp on the outskirts of Mostar. Poem written by Zanita Osovic, refugee living in Germany, November 1993, Our Land. Everywhere from Brod to Mostar, our folk are vanquished or exiled and scattered around the world. Until yesterday we lived together, sharing all, both the good and bad. Now they banish us from Bosnia, from our own land. Get your head around what Paul has done with this book. It's like one part kind of war documentation, like evidence. Another part is cultural. There's poems in here. There's glimpse of like news articles, quotes from people who were in kind of the United Nations or in kind of government. It's just sort of this massive overview, but on a very kind of personal level. It's not that kind of dehumanized history textbook talking about the conflict in a very detached kind of news way. This is a real account from someone who was really there, obviously photographing and touched by kind of the lives that he saw. Peter Mas, love thy neighbour. I, Velkic Ibrahim from Bosanski Novi, by my own will came to this office after I was informed of the order of the War Crisis Committee of the Bosanski Novi district about the criteria for the possibility to emigrate, and I hereby give the following statement. I state in the district of Bosanski Novi I do not own any property, and that I permanently leave the district of Bosanski Novi with my wife and 2 sons and 2 daughters-in-law. I give this statement with complete reasonability, without any pressure, and in the aim of obtaining documents for permanent emigration departure from the district of Bosanski Novi. This statement has the authority of an executive documentation. So ruined buildings here as a kind of montage. Written by an elderly refugee from Fokker on her return to home, summer 2001. Believe people in what I'm saying. I went all around the world, but nowhere except here have I found the peace for my soul except here, because the sun never shone on me as it does here, because this is mine and to me, and this belongs only to me and nowhere else. Dobrica Kosic, Serbian nationalist writer and Yugoslav president, 1992 to 1993. The entire project of provinces in Bosnia-Herzegovina is historically temporary. Brothers and sisters, Elijah State does not exist. An Islamic State no longer exists. It is over. We have to understand it. A federation will exist, which is not yet equitable, but it will be. In the places where a Serbian house and Serbian land exists and where the Serbian language is spoken, there will be a Serbian state. Doors and keys wait to be fitted to houses in Fokker that have been renovated by the international community so that their Muslim owners can reclaim their property and return to their former homes. Nam Republika Sparkska. Yeah, this is a wild photo here. So, just on a compositional level, this woman kind of so upset here, kind of waving her hands, and this shot of them loading up a car. It's like, it's 2 photographs, but it's 1 photograph. It's incredible. It says here, Muslim families move back into their homes in Fokker and near Dubuj after having rebuilt them largely through their own efforts. Thousands of Bosnian Muslims have gone back to live amongst the Serbs who attacked them during the war, the desire to return to their land overcoming their fears for future relations between the 2 groups. And it's such a wild shot. The survivors. Now, I want to talk about this photo. I think it's an insanely good photograph and it's very profound. I mentioned earlier in the video, but some bozo I met, when he found out Paul had died and knew that I knew Paul, he said, oh yeah, it's really sad, but I didn't rate him as a photographer. Again, douchebag, right? If you're watching, douche. This is a great photograph, and I'll tell you why. So this is during a wedding. This is after the conflict, right? This is the couple having a kiss, but here's why it's just brilliant. Okay, first off, just composition, the way they're placed here. There's this lovely negative space, which we're now looking down onto Sarajevo. This woman in the foreground. So it's interesting. There's a foreground element, there's a background element, there's nice composition. Good. This is where it goes beyond that. This is why Paul Lowe's a great photographer. These guys, for me, both with the shaven heads, both with similar builds, they look like twins to me. They look like twins. And it's a bit like that Roman sort of idea of Janus, like this 2-headed god, one looking to the past, one looking to the future, the sense of duality. Yes, this man is now married, and yes, there's the love and joy of a future life. At the same time, there's this man looking back over his shoulder, back to the bombed out, or now kind of not bombed out, but back to Sarajevo, back to the war, looking back. In this photograph, you're looking to the future and you're looking to the past at the same time. I think it's incredible. You might look at that and be, oh, it's just a couple kissing. Well, you know what, that's pretty good too. Do you understand? It's both beautiful on a very surface level, because you can see this nice composition here, lovely exposure, Coca-Cola bottle here, lovely kind of line. The fact you've got a bit of horizon here just for that composition. No ugly lines, nothing kind of blocking anyone's line. It's all very nice. And at the same time, there's what I said, that for me, there's this profound, deep and more deeply resonant meaning. This idea that you can experience immense loss, suffering and drama and find a future, and that's exactly what Paul did. Once Paul fell in love and started a family, he stopped photographing conflict. But at the same time, because of the nature of his job, of being a photojournalist who covered conflict, he was also always looking back. So this is it. This is like Paul. This is a self-portrait of a person who's experienced great horror and stuff, but also wanting to experience life and love and future. That's why it's a great photograph. The survivors. Peacetime has brought mixed blessings to Bosnia. The country is still divided, with the tensions between the Bosnian Federation and Republican sparks acting as a backdrop to economic stagnation and the huge problem of rebuilding the shattered infrastructure. However, for ordinary Bosnians, life goes on. Cafes line the streets of Sarajevo in the summer, the Olympic ski resorts are open in the winter, religious festivals are once again observed, and village life goes on as it always has, and the young men jump from the old bridge in Mostar, continuing a centuries-old tradition. And again, you know, you get out what you get in, you know? You get out what you put in, guys, in photography. You could look at this photograph and be like, yeah, it's just a bunch of shadows. But yeah, a lot of these shadows, these guys are missing limbs. In the shadows, you can see they're missing a leg, okay? And even we've got a little edge of a foot here. Kind of commenting on that, you know? Sledging, fun, day life, these girls walking past with the tight jeans and the guys kind of looking. It's trying to, again, make that, you know, that balance. This is Paul again, having a good time. Teletubbies there for some bizarre reason. I'm not sure what's going on that one. Adeline Paulina Irby and Georgina Moore Mackenzie travels in the Slavonic provinces of Turkey in Europe, 1877. So we're kind of bookending this historical quotes here, which is obviously a big part of Paul's background, which I'll get into in a minute. As far as the Aboriginal Bosnians are concerned, to understand their spiritual makeup and inclinations, we must not forget that they, far from becoming Turks, have remained Slavs by nationality. Although deeply religious, they love their country, are deeply patriotic, and if they are forced to fight against their Christian countrymen, they do so with deep regret, which sometimes forces them to desert in battle rather than commit a kind of fratricide. There we go. Same quote here. Similar text. The Bosnians' love of their own country is very great. They remain as close to the frontier as they can, within sight of their own hills. One poor man came from a distant village to Kostanzinica and crossed the bridge onto the narrow strip of land by the Austrian fortress on the other side to breathe his native air. The air of Bosnia, he said, smells like a rose. Mesela Selimovic, Deaf and the Dervish. I call to witness the ink, the quill, and the script which flows from the quill. I call to witness the faltering shadows of the sinking evening, the night, and all she enlivens. I call to witness the day of resurrection, the soul that accuses itself. I call to witness time, the beginning and end of all things, to witness that every man always suffers loss. Funny guy here kicking a horse, just the way they're holding hands again, great composition. He liked layering up his compositions, didn't he? He's done this a number of times throughout the book. You have some people in the kind of close to the foreground right near you and then an element behind. Again, Mesela Selimovic. We live in the borderlands between two worlds, on the borders between nations, and within everyone's reach, always someone's scapegoat. Against us the waves of history break as if against a cliff. The ski resort here, and the guys, I guess, in the basketball team, a lot of them missing limbs, and a bombed out building. And finally, he who builds a bridge will join two worlds. He who pulls it down will lose both of them. Hussein Bassik, when the Lord's houses were burning, and this famous ritual of jumping off the bridge that was mentioned earlier in the book. And there you have it, folks. That was Paul Lowe's Bosnians. Heck of a book, right? Paul Lowe, for me, represented the first photographer who kind of got what I was trying to do. I was studying as a student an undergraduate degree, a BA, that was very conceptual. It was very constructed in conceptual photography, and in the course of my studies I just got into, I didn't know at the time because you weren't really pushed towards that direction, but documentary photography and photojournalism. For me it was like, you know, stepping out of Plato's cave. Everyone was playing with dolls and playing dress up and doing funny little games and clever little games. And at some point I left with my camera and I went into the real world, and there was this whole other thing that opened up to me. And for me it was the power of the real. And I didn't get a good grade for my degree. I got a 2-2, commonly sometimes called a Desmond, like Desmond Tutu. And it was not good. And I didn't help myself. I had an external examiner come Peter Kennard, and I was a bit of a weird place. I was having some issues. My dad was dying of cancer, and I told him my work was evil and needed to be destroyed. So if you want to get a bad degree grade, remember to tell the external examiner that. So when I found out about Paul Lowe's course and who Paul Lowe was, I wanted to study it. And I went to interview him in 2005 in the bowels of LCC, the London College of Communication. And I knew going in I was a little bit wiser, because I realised how important it was, like what your tutor was into photographically. That you don't study photography and you get photography, you get whatever your tutor thinks photography is. So going in to see Paul, I was like, I'm going to do this interview. If it doesn't gel, if I don't connect, I'm not doing the course. And as I opened the door, Paul sat in blue bootcut jeans and an untucked in black shirt, and that's exactly what I was wearing. And also bizarrely, I remember at the time, like, thinking he's kind of an old dude. He was 43. I think he was 43, which is the age I am now when he was actually teaching me, which again is so weird, isn't it, getting old? But yeah, the interview went great, and he got it. He got it. He got what I was trying to do. And when he would lecture, I'd be like at the front of the class like a nodding dog, because it was like insane for me, because the things he was saying, his observations as a photojournalist, the things he'd experienced, I'd experienced too over 7 years of being a photographer, photographing like the same way, but no one had taught me. I just started doing it. So again, it was an immense validation for me to have Paul as a tutor. And within a few weeks, my dad was very sick with cancer, and we were doing photo essays, and I thought my photo essay could be trying to get dad, because he'd worked in Germany, trying to get my dad to a hospital in Munich where he'd worked, and his company had a little office. So on my own, I managed to get him on an EasyJet flight, and I photographed the whole thing. I got him to Munich, and I basically was with him for 7 days while he just slowly ebbed away and died, sat at the end of his bed, sort of watching him die, and I photographed it all. And I never used the photos for anything, but I did have to use it for an assignment, because I was supposed to be doing assignments at the point. So Paul saw those photos, and he was super supportive, and I think he gave me a lot of breaks because of that. And he knew that I was sort of struggling a little bit financially, so he'd give me like assisting work or hook me up with contacts. You know, Paul was great in that way, in that he wasn't just great teaching, but really on you, like really focused on what you were doing, like really cared, really paid attention. Which I'm telling you, man, if you've studied a degree anywhere, you know what I'm talking about. A lot of people, it's cursory; they're not really engaging with you. Whereas Paul really looked at your work, really took it in, and was sort of trying to make it better. But also Paul connected you to people. If he could find someone or something or some idea to help you progress, whether it be like a photo editor meeting or someone else to talk to or someone to collaborate with, that's what he was doing. Paul was a great connector. So there we go. I think he might have liked this episode, because I knew he did watch the show. And bizarrely, I think the day before he died, he actually shared the interview I did with Mike Goldwater talking about network photographers, because Paul was a member of Network Photo Agency. So that was kind of surreal. In fact, the whole thing has been really surreal. There's a photograph in the book that I showed you earlier of the woman being helped by the 2 UN peacekeepers. Well, it was very strange for me, but just after my dad died, there was an earthquake in my hometown of Folkestone while I was Paul's student. And my photo that was on the front page of all the newspapers and everything was a photo of an old woman getting helped out of her house by 2 policemen flanking her either side in a very kind of almost, I don't even know if I'd seen that photo of his at that point. That's the really weird thing. I don't think I had. Just a weird sort of kismet kind of connection. But yeah, what Paul did the next day was that he brought that newspaper in and held it up to the class and made everyone give me a round of applause for having that photo and getting that coverage. But yeah, I think, yeah, that whole thing for Paul was about the belief. He could believe in people who didn't believe in themselves, and that was enough. He'd just do it. I've got a weird kind of thing for me, obviously, connected to losing my dad and Paul being around, but then not. But then, you know, all this other stuff. But I found out something recently which made me chuckle, was that it turns out the the Times did an obituary of Paul, and it led with the fact he got a 2-2 as well. So for his history degree at Cambridge, he only got a 2-2. And there I was worried about going for the interview of only getting a 2-2 because he had a 2-2 as well, which I thought was kind of funny. So I've got this weird kind of life philosophy that I've developed through being a wacky photographer guy and seeing things, where I start to sort of see the world outside of time. Like when I photograph, I'm very aware that the photograph I'm going to take is now, but it's also going to be in 20 years' time. And in that way, for me, I know it sounds nuts, as a photographer, I don't really feel like time exists. I feel like the past, present, and future are one. There's just a moment. I know it sounds utterly crazy, but check this out. Paul Lowe was studying history at Cambridge University, yeah? He's studying history. That's his thing. And at some point during the course of that study, he went from being like, yeah, you know what, I could write on history, I could lecture on history. And he realised, because of obviously his love for James Nachtwey and photography, why write about history when you can experience history? And that's exactly what he did. He was at like flashpoints across the 80s and 90s, like the late 20th century, hugely significant historical events. And he was there, experiencing history, because I think deep down Paul understood that this right now, this moment, this is history. So yeah, on some weird level, yeah, I do feel like, yeah, that's another reason why we're kind of on the same page, that weird sort of understanding of like now is history. Okay, well that was a really long one, it was kind of rambling. I don't know, like if you're still watching, wow, thank you for watching all that. But yeah, I just felt like I had to go through the entire book because you just can't get it. They'll probably do a re-edition now. I bet you they do a re-edition now, but right now it doesn't exist. It's a great book. Paul Lowe's a great photographer, a great person, a great teacher, a great supporter, a great champion. I didn't even get into all his running stuff, all this crazy like marathon shit and all that jazz, but yeah, just the world is lesser for him not being here.